Hi, my name is Al Zelaya. I am an urban forester with the Davie Institute in Chicago, and I would like to thank Mike and Erica for inviting me to speak to the Urban Ecological Collaborative today. I'm going to chat a little bit, mostly about iTree, and I'll give you a little bit of background information which might provide some context before I dive into this. This presentation was originally part of a symposium which was presented at the Society of Ecological Restoration's World Conference in Madison back in the fall. And the symposium was put together by my colleague Michael Leff, who is at the Urban Field Station in Philadelphia. So I certainly wanted to acknowledge all his efforts in bringing this together. And I believe that he actually recorded his piece earlier, and I think Linda Nagel will be recording her piece also. So he'll almost have all the pieces of the puzzle with the exception of Dave Nowak's piece. My particular piece of the symposium was to look at the potential of using urban forest management and assessment tools within the context of ecological restoration or natural areas management. So tools that were traditionally designed and used by cities, counties, urban foresters, arborists, and so forth, and what are the possibilities and the limitations to try to use these tools for different purposes like natural areas management and restoration ecology. So that was kind of the focus of the symposium. So what I'd like to do is break this down into a couple segments, and I'm going to provide a little bit of iTree background. I know many of you have used iTree before and know a little bit about this, so this will be review, and then we will look specifically at one component within the iTree suite, which is iTree Eco. And then after that, I would like to kind of explore some restoration applications. How might we use iTree Eco within the area of ecological restoration? So we'll look at a couple scenarios. So a little bit of background about iTree. iTree was developed by the U.S. Forest Service and a number of partners. It is public domain software, so you can go on a website and download this for free. It's dynamic. It's continuously being improved. We just released iTree 2014, which is what we're calling the new release for this year, just about a week ago. So that is now available for download with some new updates to a couple of the online tools and iTree Hydro. And we also provide technical support, and that's much of what I spend my day helping folks use these tools, because there are some technical challenges definitely when you're using iTree. And there are a number of partners now that manage this collectively, so we refer to them as the iTree Cooperative, led by the Forest Service, Davie, who I work for, the Arbor Day Foundation, the Society of Municipal Arborists, International Society of Arboriculture, and KC Trees, and also Syracuse University. Ted Andretti and his team at ESF have certainly helped us out a lot with the development of the iTree Hydro model. And iTree really has expanded since it was first introduced in 2006. And really, I would say just about maybe a quarter of our users now are international. So there's a number of tools, including iTree Eco, which I'll be talking about today, which are used internationally. So we have a number of projects from the UK, Romania, Bangkok that have all come through this year. And so it certainly presents some opportunities, but also some challenges to try to accommodate folks who want to try to use this model overseas, and also the dealing with the limitations too of trying to adapt the model that was really developed for use in North America to be used in countries like Brazil and so forth. So it certainly presents some interesting things for our team, let's say. So the basic premise behind iTree is it is a benefit-based approach to natural resource assessment. So it uses forest structure, that is species, size, distribution in a landscape, information which can be measured in the field, and then takes that information and runs that through these models to provide functional information, or here ecosystem services. So it allows us to move along a progression. So there are a lot of different things like tree inventories, which are traditionally used by arborists and urban foresters, which will provide structural information. iTree allows you to move along a progression to find out, well, what is that structure providing to society? So what are the values that can be obtained from that resource in terms of pollution interception or stormwater capture or carbon sequestration. And so I like to use the term comprehensive values. Now, it certainly doesn't mean a complete value, because iTree isn't capturing all the values that forest can provide, but it allows us to have a better picture of some of those values that are being provided by that urban forest. And that in turn allows us to be more strategic, both in our management and planning and also advocacy. So let me take a minute and try to tie the iTree benefit-based approach to a natural resource challenge that many people are starting to have to deal with, and that is, how do you manage natural systems to be resilient through climate change? And this is just a map that was developed by the Chicago Wilderness Climate Action Plan, and it kind of shows the progression of the potential changes in climate, both temperature and precipitation, that might occur over time for the state of Illinois. So you can see there's various different scenarios based on different emission scenarios that might occur in the future. So there is a lot of uncertainty in trying to plan and make decisions with this type of challenge that is facing many natural resource managers. I've always liked the idea of adaptive management, and this is just kind of a update of the adaptive management process cycle in a recent article in Ecology and Society by Brenda Lynn and Brian Peterson. And they pose the idea of using a prioritization of function at the beginning, at the front end of the adaptive management cycle. And you can see that in the balloon kind of sticking out to the upper right. So as you're assessing the problem, prioritizing what are those functions which are key to society or environmental managers and so forth that we want to try to maintain through some type of stress or transition, whether it be climate change, pest outbreak, or so forth, and that using that to then allow or guide the design process of a prescription or management action, and then implementing, monitoring, and going through the evaluation process. So you can see how structure, function, value, management, action kind of ties in, where something like iTree really can be used to help in this type of decision-making process. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the iTree suite, and as I mentioned, I am going to focus today primarily on eco. I wanted to briefly just talk about the other tools that I have up here, because these might be of interest to folks who may be listening in. So iTree Streets was a tool that was developed by Greg McPherson and his team out at University of California, Davis. And that's a tool that is designed primarily for assessing street trees. So it really works well for urban foresters who manage street trees, trees in a right-of-way, may have an existing inventory, and those can be imported into iTree Streets, and you can get similar types of ecosystem service estimates and values that you would in iTree Eco, but it is primarily designed for street trees, so not necessarily a tool that would work for folks managing natural areas and so on. And iTree Design is a newer tool, which is an online tool, and that really uses some of the technology both in eco and streets, and allows people to really do assessments at the home scale level if they so desire. So it's a tool that's for homeowners, schools, landscape planners. It's a really easy tool to use, and you basically can outline your parcel using a Google Map interface, place a tree around there, and then see some of the ecosystem services that might be estimated ascribed to that tree in relationship to a property. iTree Canopy is a tool that's used for estimating canopy cover or other cover types by using a simple random sample of generating points throughout an area of interest. You would then have to decide if those points are a certain cover type based on where that happens to land on a Google map. And after surveying about 500 to 1,000 points, which may take anywhere from 3 to 5 hours, you would have a good statistical estimate of canopy cover in an area of interest. iTreeView is a desktop application which uses national land cover data sets, which are 30-meter resolutions that are freely available, and it will also do an assessment of canopy and other cover types, and then also do some rough ecosystem service estimates. iTree Hydro is a newer tool, which is a hydrology modeling tool. So that looks at the impacts of how canopy change and how impervious change affect local stream flow and water quality. So there is a new version of Hydro out, an update to design and an update to canopy with the release of iTree 2014. So I'm going to focus now on iTree Eco. And this just gives you a snapshot of what it provides. So again, it gives you information on forest structure. You would have to go out and do the measurements. It would provide you information on estimated number of trees, species composition, tree size, tree DBH, condition, leaf area, tree biomass, and it would use that information then to provide ecosystem service values. So air pollution removal, carbon monoxide, ozone, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and particulate matter removal of PM10 and PM2.5. It would also provide estimates of carbon sequestration and carbon storage. And then there's some optional features like energy effects. So if you measure the distance and direction of trees in proximity to a dwelling, it will provide energy effect information. There's some newer reports now where it will also provide information on avoided stormwater runoff and public health impacts, which I'll show you a little bit later. And then it also provides monetary values. So it uses economic externality values and other multipliers to actually monetize some of these benefits that are being provided. And then there's also some management information. So there's pest risk information, basically looking at your forest structure, and then giving you some information as to here are the known pests within your area or within a range of miles of your area, and what you may want to look out for and what could be at risk. And so there's information on tree health and then also some invasives. And we'll look at a couple of these, and we'll move through some of these so you'll get an idea of what some of the outputs look like. And just to give you a little bit of background on the model structure, as I mentioned, it is a model that requires field data. The data requirements for ECO can be rather extensive, so it is requiring more than traditional tree inventories such as tree species and DBH and possibly condition. ECO actually needs you to provide tree height, bole height, canopy width. You also need to tell it how much of the crown's missing, how much dieback there is, and then there's a number of other variables related to the plot, and if you're interested in ground covers. So it's pretty extensive, and you're essentially giving the model almost a 3D representation of that canopy, because benefits are driven by leaf surface, and so you have to provide that information for the model. So that is actually fed into the ECO model, and there's an extensive species database of over 6,000 species, locational information, so it's using information that's relative to your city, local pollution, and local weather. So it's seeing how your forest resource is interacting with these local conditions of pollution and weather, and then it's going to generate statistical estimates of those values, and it's going to provide standard errors also. And I did want to mention that this is just a really quick snapshot of the structure, but all the information and the background methods and so forth can be found on the iTree website. So I did want to just pop that up really fast just so I can show you where that is in case folks are interested in actually learning a little bit more. So if you go to the iTree website, itreetools.org, and look under resources, archives, we keep all the methods papers and documentation for the eco model and all the other models here too. So you can actually find out quite a bit about the model calculations and so forth, and we try to update that when new information becomes available. And there's also project planning resource too. So there's a number of different resources that are available on the website, but this is just a quick snapshot of how that data would actually flow through there. And at the back end, this is kind of an idea of some of the information that comes out. This is from an old project the city of Chicago did, and so it's just giving you some of the executive summary snapshot numbers, tree cover percentage, population, and the carbon storage and sequestration, building energy, and structural value. Somebody did have a question of what is the difference between storage and sequestration. And so sequestration is what is being sequestered annually by that forest resource, whereas carbon storage is looking at the total storage of that resource up to that point in time of the resource. So it is not an annual value, it is just saying that that is what is being stored by that resource. And so that was a city assessment, and this is a more recent assessment of the 7-county area, which also encompasses Chicago. So this is a more recent project, and you can see that this one is really scaled up. So we've seen a number of projects at city scale, and now we've had a number of projects that we're starting to see at regional scales, but we really have not seen that many where folks are doing things that are specifically designed to look at natural areas or parks or restoration type applications. So that's what I kind of wanted to focus on, is go in a different direction. So what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about how does iTree work, a little bit more of the mechanics of actually creating a project and getting through one. And so we'll talk about project design. And I think the first thing that I always try to advise folks is to start with your objectives in mind first. What are you hoping to achieve by going through this whole process? Will this particular tool help you meet those objectives? Perhaps there's an easier tool, perhaps there's a different tool, perhaps iTree won't, or it may be complementary and you might have to use other tools. So there are a number of things that really kind of you need to start out at the beginning and have a good understanding of what it's going to provide, and is it going to help answer the questions that you hope it would. And then you also have to consider your resources. As I mentioned, it's a lot more in terms of data collection than a typical inventory that most people might be familiar with. So do you have the resources and the time to actually carry out a project or to manage a project while you're doing your normal job duties? So there are a lot of things to kind of consider up front, which will help make the process going forward much more smoother. And then within the eco framework, there are different options that you have too. So as I mentioned, like energy effects is one option, collecting shrub data. So a lot of people that do basic urban studies may choose not to collect shrub information, may choose not to collect pest data. So there are different decisions that you have to make, and a lot of that is driven both by your resources and also the skills of the folks who might be doing the data collection for you. If you're working with volunteers, you may not feel comfortable with them evaluating some of the things that are related to using the pest detection module, which is another option within eco. And then there are different scales. So this is one of the things too which can be challenging. Here's something where you could actually do, we've seen city, we've seen regional, you can do watershed scale analysis, or you can also do something smaller. You can look at a city park, you could look at communities within a park. There are a number of different ways that you can design a project, and it all goes back to, again, the objectives. What is it that you want to look at, and do you want to compare areas within your overall study? So you might have a stratification scheme. So these are all things that really kind of have to be thought out before you actually start going out and doing some data collection. So there are two different options for collecting data using eco. There's the random sample method, and there's also a complete inventory method. The complete inventory method was introduced just a couple years ago. This was originally designed for using random samples at the city scale, and then we've had more of a demand to use eco on smaller scales, such as this example below where you see a park and all the trees in here are then captured and sampled and then run through the model. So this might be a case where there might be a couple hundred trees, but we have seen some of these where folks have input several thousand trees using this complete inventory method. So that certainly is an option. Traditionally, though, it is used as a random sample protocol, and so you would generate generally 200 tenth acre plots throughout an area of interest. And then you would then have to navigate to those random plots and collect information about the vegetation within those plots, other characteristics, ground cover, and then if you are collecting some of those optional attributes like shrubs and so forth, energy effects. So if there were a building within proximity to a tree in that plot, you would then have to measure the distance and direction, and then the model would calculate the effects, the energy effects of that tree to that building to provide an energy conservation value that would be extrapolated over the population. One of the common questions that comes up is, does that 200 plots apply to different size cities? And that's something that's a little bit harder to get a grasp on for people who are considering using random sampling with eco. And this is just a chart that shows a relationship of plot quantity as it relates to standard error. And so the number of plots tends to drive standard error more so than the area that's being sampled. So the 200 generally would apply for most cities. Now that might certainly be different for natural areas, and I probably would not start out with 200 if I was just looking at a 500 acre parcel that was vegetated and it was evenly distributed and so forth. I would start somewhere much lower along this scale and then try to see where my standard error is after initial sample, and then make adjustments accordingly and decide how many plots going forward I may be doing. So it's something that there really is not just a simple answer that if you're doing a 500 parcel you need to do X plots, or if you're doing a 5,000 acre sample you need to do Y plots. So it's something that's really difficult for us to provide that type of information, where we often tell folks to refer to a statistician to help you design a project if it's something that you really need to control the standard error. But you can see here that this is where the 200 kind of comes from, and so there's a diminishing return after you can do 350 plots, but your standard error may only be 9% as opposed to 11% with 230 plots. And this does not necessarily mean that every city is going to have the same, or every project is going to have the same standard error, because it really has to do also with the distribution of vegetation throughout an area and the sampling protocol that you might use if it's randomly generated, or if you use a grid system or so forth. So there are a lot of variables which kind of make plot design a little bit challenging. So that's something, but it's not a universal number, but we tend to use that as a starting point in guiding people with project creation. So let's talk a little bit about some of the data collection options. So there are a number of different ways that you can actually collect data now. So you can still use paper. That's probably one of the most reliable ways, and many people still do use paper. There is a PDA application. It's a bit outdated because it runs on Windows Mobile OS, which is no longer put in devices anymore. But now there's a newer option where you can use smartphones. We like to call it a mobile data collection system. So you do need internet connectivity on a device. So if you have an iPhone or an iPad with internet connectivity, things like that can actually be used for data collection. So it opens up iTree data collection for people that may not have wanted to invest in buying PDAs or devices for a one-time use. And that was one of the hard things with folks who may do an iTree project in the past. It's hard to invest in a PDA just for an iTree project unless you have some other use for it. So most people have smartphones, and you might be able to do projects with volunteers now more easily. So then we go to the variables, and yeah, here again it's more than just DBH species, where you're getting all the other metrics, crown parameters, and also plot variables and ground cover variables too. And then there's all the optional information that's available. One of the things that I did add in here too is the value of doing quality assurance and quality checks early and often. I recently spoke with some project managers who completed some projects, and that was one of the things that I think that a good lesson learned is trying to look at the data early and get crews corrected where they need to be corrected to try to keep data collection consistent between crews. And the earlier you can start that and correct problems and look at data, it just will make for a better experience going forward. And then after data is collected and entered through the desktop application, it is then just submitted for processing. The processing system is automated now, so it generally will return results usually within an hour or two, and you'll receive an email with a zip file name, and that is just a file that would then be downloaded into your desktop, and that would populate the reports. So that's a little bit of how that system moves through. So we'll look at two different scenarios where iTree Eco might be an effective tool to use, or at least one to consider. So one of these is just applying the same type of methodology but using it in parks or natural areas to determine baseline data. And so this is an example of one of the few projects that we've seen where somebody has actually tried to use eco for that type of purpose. And so as I mentioned, these are few and far between. I think I've only seen maybe 2 of these in about the past 5 years. It doesn't mean that other folks haven't done this. We just don't see all the data that is now run through the system. So this is one that was run a few years ago by Charlie Kearns, who was the project manager of this project, and I certainly want to acknowledge all the work that he did and his willingness for sharing some of the information and his experience about the project that was done in Three Rivers Park District up in Minneapolis. So this is in Hennepin County, and so it is a 27,000 acre park, and they were doing plots on over 10,000 acres of their natural areas and parks. And here again, just trying to see what are those benefits and ecosystem services that were associated with the forest resource. And so they decided to use iTree Eco plot-based method to do this project. And many challenges with this. The data was incomplete for what I'm going to show you here. I think they had well over 200 plots. They used a standard recommendation for generating plots, but during the first year of data, I believe they were only able to collect maybe about a quarter or so of the actual plots they had wanted to. And generally doing these wooded plots took them about 1 day per plot. So it was pretty slow when you look at projects that are completed in urban areas that might just be in city streets, backyards, and so forth. You tend to see that folks can go through 3 to 5 plots a day. So there certainly is a factor to consider when you're working in these vegetated areas. And this is just a snapshot of some of the information that they received back with that preliminary information. And I reran some of the original plot data that Charlie had supplied so that we can look at some of the newer reports that are now available in ECO, which they did not have access to back when this was originally collected. So here is just species distribution information based on that early data that was submitted. And so you can see here that sugar maple, eastern hop hornbeam, Astraea virginiana, and American elm make up the largest percentage of species. And then we can look at diameter distribution. So this gives us an idea of the age. And so you can see here that it looks like about maybe in these first 2 ranges, 0 to 6 dBH. So you almost have about 70% of the trees are relatively small stature trees. Species origin, so it gives you information as to the percentage of species that are native to North America or the state where this study was conducted, which are considered invasive based on the state database that we have this tied to. Species importance, as I mentioned, this is a benefit-based model, so leaf area drives benefits, and so it's not just looking at the importance of stems, it's looking at the relative importance of leaf area also with the population to provide an importance value. So you can see here a tree like northern red oak, not as many stems as some of the other trees like hornbeam, but because of the size of, it's probably a larger stature tree, it's higher up than many of other trees further down like buckthorn, which is a small invasive. So canopy drives benefits, and this gives you an idea of just looking at the resource in a different way where canopy does matter, and it's just not also the percent of the population. Invasive information here too, so it looks at the species that were collected and it'll give you information as to what are the percentage of those invasives in that population. And there are a number of other reports that this will provide, and it does summarize by species, and also it will, if you do a stratified project, it will summarize it by that stratification scheme. And so whether you do it by different land cover types, if you're classifying areas by, say, residential or commercial, or you may be doing it just by neighborhood, or in case of natural areas, it might be parks or different, or it may be different plant communities of all your parks. So there are a number of different ways that you can look at the information. And these are an example of some of the forest function outputs. So here we can see the pollutant removal outputs for carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, ozone, particulate matter, and sulfur dioxide. And it provides information both monthly and hourly. This is annual sequestration, and it's showing you which are the trees that are providing the most annual sequestration. And this is just another chart showing oxygen production, which is related to sequestration, and it's showing you some of the leaf area relationships of these species. And this is just from one of the actual printouts in the written report. It also does produce a canned written report. As I mentioned earlier, one of the newer reports is the avoided runoff. Here it's showing you the species that are contributing most to the overall impact of reducing runoff. And this is an example of one of the newer reports that I mentioned, Human Health Impacts and Values, and this is based on the EPA's BenMap model. So the EPA has a standalone model which looks at the impacts of pollutant concentration reduction and how that relates to health impacts. And so we've actually taken that model and built that into the iTree Eco model, since Eco is also looking at pollutant removal of some of these same pollutants that are in the EPA's BenMap model. So we can now start trying to make a correlation between some of the pollution removal that we know can be attributed to the urban forest canopy and how that relates to public health impacts. So this is really something new, and I think somewhat exciting for us also, because it's helping us build that bridge. And this is an idea of what the data look like for Three Rivers Park. And so you can see the incident reduction. This is just for particulate matter 2.5 pollution. So it's showing you, based on the reduction of pollutant concentration, that there are, say, 36 less incidences per year of asthma, and that has a value ascribed to it of about $2,900. So it gives you a monetary value based on that EPA model also. And you can see here that something like mortality has a very significant dollar value to it, and so that's why even a small reduction in incidence, in this case just 0.13, still carries a significant value to it just for this particular pollutant. And this also takes into consideration population density. So we're using figures for Hennepin County here, which I believe has about 1.2 million people. But if you look at a similar report for New York City, where there is a tremendously high level of population density, so a small reduction in pollutant concentration is going to be felt by many more people. You can see here that the incident reduction per year for their urban forests is significantly higher. So it has a lot to do with population density too, and also just it's not just the urban forests and the number of trees, it's the people that are being impacted and affected. And so it's a really interesting way to now look at the impacts of pollution reduction. Another one of the newer reports that's available is risks to insects and diseases. So within the iTree Eco model, there are now databases that it ties to, and I actually put the website at the bottom because this was one of the questions that came up during the actual webinar is, well, how can I get to those maps? And so if you're interested, they're from the Forest Health Enterprise Technology website, and that is the website in the lower right if you want to try to look at where some of that data is derived from. And it's actually built into databases now in the model. And so it looks at the forest structure and the resource based on the inventory that was captured, and it will tell you based on these databases, which are updated periodically, do you have trees that are within known areas of risk. So in this particular case, within Hennepin County, there's known to be DED. Emerald ash borer is telling you that these are the number of trees that are within risk. Oak wilt. There are keys available for all these codes at the bottom. And so then it goes further out. So now it's looking at 250 miles of Hennepin County, and it's saying that these are the known pests that are here, and it's also showing you the number of trees at risk. Pests like gypsy moth, which has many different hosts, you'll see that it has, or Asian longhorn beetle will have usually a higher structural value at risk because it has many more hosts than something like emerald ash borer, where ash is essentially the only thing that is at risk to that specific pest. And then further on out, 750 miles, so we can see Asian longhorn beetle appears within that range. And then beyond that, it lists some other pests that are within the database, which may be way farther out, things like sudden oak death. So it's just a different way of looking at your resource and what might be at risk. So this is just a snapshot of that baseline data from the executive summary, and it gives you some of those numbers that you may not have had any clue that that resource was providing. So things like pollution removal, carbon storage, carbon sequestration, avoided runoff. So it allows the folks at Three Rivers Park District to now either make some management decisions or look at those risks or make or advocate for funding. So there's a number of different things that you can do with this data, or you can keep the data and do an assessment over time and go back to those plots and see how things change. So very quickly, I just wanted to do one other scenario, and this was put together actually by my colleague Jason Henning, who is also in the Philadelphia Field Station, and my colleague Michael Leff. This was a site that was being considered for actually a restoration, or I should say reclamation project, to turn it into a park. So it is something that was just land that was not being used in Camden, New Jersey, and somebody had a concept of trying to create a park in that area, and that evolved into a more detailed plan of actual trees and species and a layout and a pretty good idea into a grant proposal. So this was something that we have some information, and we could actually take those species and run that into iTree Eco using some tree characteristic measurements to create a mock inventory of those trees that you see there in the future. So we know there's 56 trees, and so it's just a matter of creating those trees and then putting in some DBHs of what those trees might be in the future. So this isn't saying that, okay, we know that a 10-inch tree is going to have a certain canopy width and canopy height. This is more or less just using some sizes that we kind of thought might work for this, just to do a proof of concept. So it's not really, we're not using a forecasting model in this particular case. We're just trying to show here's what trees might provide in the future to help make the case for this project. And that data is taken and then imported into iTree Eco, and there are benefits that are then estimated for that inventory. And so this is just some of the results for that. So you can see 10 tons of carbon being stored, 5,500 gallons of rainfall being avoided each year. So it allows somebody to possibly make the case for the project, and also not just to get beyond planting the trees to actually caring for the trees so that they do reach a mature state or at least an intermediate state. And certainly that's a challenge too. It's easy to get trees in the ground, but to have them thrive is another challenge. So you can help make the case for the maintenance after and the care after of these trees by trying to bring in some of this information of the potential ecosystem services and the values provided to that community. So I did briefly want to talk a little bit about some of the limitations, and I like to call them considerations because some of these things are constantly changing with the iTree models, but there are a number of things, and I guess as I look at the utility of using iTree Eco for restoration of natural areas management projects, I would see it as a complementary tool at this point. I think that there definitely are some things that iTree isn't going to capture. It can't capture a lot of things related to wildlife. It can't capture ecosystem services currently related to the herbaceous layer. So there are a lot of things that iTree just can't provide, and that is a limitation that we are trying to address. So we are looking at ways of how can we integrate forest structure and see what that means to wildlife habitat. We're also looking at the potential of integrating some of the pollution models that can handle crops and grasses and so forth. So these are certainly things that we just have not had the demand from the user base that we may be able to address to make this tool more appealing to folks who are dealing in natural areas and restoration type projects. But certainly it's worth considering just the challenge of collecting data in natural areas too. So anybody who's done a project and who has spent a day or two or three in one plot can certainly tell you that that can be challenging for both crews and just the cost, and also for going back and measuring those plots in the future. It's really difficult to try to find a plot center in a wooded plot unless you can have some type of permanent marker put in the ground. But there are certainly some challenges with that. So the tool is certainly free, the software is free, but the time to do the data collection is typically not, unless you're fortunate to have volunteers or students who are looking to get experience in this type of work. iTree Eco does not have forecasting capabilities integrated in it currently, so that's one of the things that it will in the future, and I think that will create some interesting opportunities for people who are more interested in restoration and natural areas projects to see how populations might change in time with various inputs, mortality, regeneration scenarios. So that is something in the future that I think will make it definitely more appealing to people in natural areas fields. And there are spatial limitations to consider. Right now, ECO doesn't have a bridge or a link to use in GIS. So there's another tool that's in the stages of early development called iTree Landscape, which will address that gap. But ECO doesn't have a way of taking data and migrating it into GIS where you can actually then do some analysis spatially. So that's one of the limitations too. And a lot of people also want to find out, well, how can I get my spatial data into ECO? And we don't have that. So iTree Landscape will kind of address some of those limitations, and that'll be a tool that'll be specific for that type of application in the future. And then also there's the communication challenges. Oftentimes where folks who are using iTree Eco in natural areas, as I've seen in some of the projects in the Chicago area, the invasives come out as the trees that are providing the most benefits in terms of ecosystem services. So these are the same trees that are being removed. So there are some communication challenges that have to be thought out as to how can you communicate the value of removing those trees that are providing ecosystem services, because the model doesn't differentiate between that. So that's something that takes a project manager or the person who's actually presenting the data to then say, here's why this is important, because we're going to be focusing on regenerating these desirable trees or so forth, or vegetation or species. And so you have to look at it more holistically, but people could tend to get caught up in just focusing on, wow, here's an invasive, it's providing all these benefits, and you're taking it out. So you have to kind of think those things through depending on what your data shows. But given those limitations, I still think that there is tremendous potential. And one of the things with iTree, if you think back in 2006, when iTree was introduced, and it was a tool that was primarily used by urban foresters, and so we had that niche right there, and we've since now introduced tools like iTree Design, where there's actually tools that can be used by homeowners and schools and nurseries and landscape architects. And in the future, moving on the opposite side, where a tool like iTree Landscape can be used at more landscape scale type applications or regional applications. So this really goes into some of the directives that the Forest Service has, which actually drive I-tree development, so things like restoring and sustaining forest landscapes, the concept of trying to make these landscapes more resilient in the face of climate change. So that we talked a little bit about the need for assessment to better drive an understanding of forest structure and the forest function, and that allows us to be better in terms of our decision making going forward as best as we can with so much uncertainty. But then, yeah, certainly things like enhancing water, and then there's also the economic aspect where tools like iTree, Eco iTree Streets, and Hydro have kind of created a whole cadre of people who actually do this now for a living, including my company. We use these tools too as consultants also, as do many other companies. So there are a lot of things where we see eco moving forward along with these other tools in the iTree suite. And so with that, just a quick recap. So for the folks who are considering this, it certainly can allow you to look at your resource in a whole different way in terms of quantifying those ecosystem services and values and looking at the distribution and magnitude of that resource and going back to improving planning and management and also those impacts of monitoring change over time. So there are a number of different ways that we think that iTree can be of value moving into different audiences and different scenarios, and just also things like the potential for advocacy, where many people have been able to effectively change policy and implement new plans and so forth by having this type of information. So with that, I am going to wrap up. So with that, I would like to say thank you to the Urban Ecological Collaborative, to Erica and Michael. And if you have any questions, my email address is below, and appreciate your time. Bye.